Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us for so long. As you can see, there is a report that is tabled for you, and it is my duty now to reduce about 8 months of work into 7 minutes. Uh, I will try my best. I ask for your patience as we start this presentation. Uh, uh, the context of this particular report is mostly the moment of flux we are seeing in global value chains. We've seen it over the years, in fact, almost since 2017 when the US China trade war started, and it has spiraled due to various other reasons. We saw the great lockdown, fractured trade relations, overdependence for essential commodities, and this came through really during the pandemic. So the puzzle we found ourselves with is, can we find an opportunity in this flux that the GVCs are facing? Uh, to understand this, we at ORF conducted an enterprise survey with 200 companies based out of India, both domestic and foreign, from 6 sectors which DPIIT has recognized as champion sectors in manufacturing. Aerospace and defense, automotive and auto components, capital goods, electronic system design and manufacturing, new and renewable energy, and pharma and medical devices. These are all up and coming sectors. These are all sectors which we see contributing to the Indian economy greatly in the next 10 to 20 years. So we examined the perception of GVCs and the causes of these disruptions. What are the domestic policies that can be updated to better integrate India into GVCs and get us along the road to a $500 trillion economy? I've shown you a specific sample profile of the respondents of this particular survey. We see respondents by revenue and we see respondents by firm age. Both of these particular factors have an impact on how industry participates in GVCs, because revenue tells us whether they're SMEs, large firms, small firms. Firm age, by deduction, would tell us that older firms are more likely to have had time to scale up and therefore participate or not participate in GVCs. So they will have a more mature argument on why they are for or against GVCs, or they have a reason not to scale up. Coming to the questions themselves. So now I'm starting on the results of the survey itself. The first question we asked, ground zero, how important is value chain integration to your company? Because one of the things we face in India is the perception that industry is negative on value chain integration. So we started at zero. Is it important to you? And you see that overwhelming number are saying that they are very much interested in GVC participation and integration. 87% of all respondents are saying that it is very important. And across the sectors, consistently above 80% are saying that it is very important to them. This is across all sectors. The next question that we asked is, did the pandemic impact your perception? Because in the last 2 years, we have seen, from the context you will remember, that over-dependence on a specific source for critical goods has cost us. So did the pandemic create more urgency for GVC integration? 89% of the companies have said that yes, it has impacted their perception. And some sectors, even if they are responding, it's somewhat urgent, they are saying that it is urgent. So maybe they see it as a 5 to 10 year commitment, but they don't see it as no commitment at all. So clearly, GVC integration is on everybody's agenda at the moment. Predictably, pharma has about 80% of respondents saying that it is extremely urgent. And because overly dependent on fractured production systems expose industry to risk and make for an uncertain business environment, which directly impacts both short and long-term business decisions. This is related to scale and investment. Both of these decisions are impacted. So this brings us to a very interesting part of our survey. We asked industry which geopolitical and geoeconomic developments most impact their investment decisions. whether in India or in the medium term. So you see here that this one thing I want to flag here, that the survey was conducted between November of 2021 and Jan of 2022. This is when the survey was actually delivered. If we had waited 10 more days, maybe the geopolitical tensions column would have been a bit more bright, because that's when the Ukraine crisis started. But we were very excited about it at the time, so we did it a bit early, and we have these results, which are also very important, because you see that global macroeconomic conditions and domestic policies are the favorites in terms of which policies are impacting decision making. So bringing us to how important is it for India to update its trade policy to enable GVC integration. We've discussed that GVC integration is important to Indian industry. We have discussed that it is urgent post-pandemic. We've decided that there are specific policies impacting. So what is trade policy got to do with it, and is it urgent to update that? You see here that 93% of pharma is saying that it is extremely urgent, and 74% of all respondents. This is significant because, again, if you look at the somewhat important column and then not important column, you find that barely anyone is saying not important, right? So trade policy upgradation is important across sectors and urgent across all firm sizes, ages, revenue groups. We asked this question out of curiosity of where India's future lies in terms of trade policy. And we asked which groupings or specific partners industry wants trade deals with. Obviously, we see that the US is a partner of choice by far, followed by the UK and the EU. We are pursuing FTAs already with 2 of these partners, have completed an FTA with the UAE, which is another recognized partner. And we see there continues to be no enthusiasm for RCEP. There's next to no enthusiasm for RCEP. In fact, if we have to choose between RCEP and maybe China, it would be maybe China. But again, no RCEP. So what impacts the domestic policy environment then? 74% of all respondents are saying that upgrading trade policy is very important. And then they are identifying availability of raw materials as the most important factor in defining FDI decisions, with a skilled workforce being a close second at 70%. The top 5 key constraints to scaling up, we see are taxation rules, quality of infrastructure, uncertain trade and tariff policies, access to capital, and the availability of raw materials again. The inability to meet quality standards is seen as a major hurdle to GVC integration. And Make in India, in fact, is seen as the most popular government policy in terms of enabling industry. So what challenges finally are companies facing? Next. Okay, which challenges are companies facing in integrating into GVCs? We can see that 90% of respondents are identifying high tariffs as a problem, whether minor or major problem. They are all identifying that it is a problem, followed by the inability to meet quality standards and poor institutional support. We've explained that in more detail in our report. So for India to better integrate into value chains, what is placed at a high priority? We see that physical and digital infrastructure is seen as number 1 priority most of the time, followed by the availability of talent and labor and streamlining financial and investment regulations. So what are the key intervention areas then? This is a very important part of our paper. If you look at table 5 in the report, you'll find more detail on this. We see that upgrading infrastructure, improving the business environment, and facilitating trade are the three major buckets under which policy action needs to take place. We're not saying that action already has not taken place. We are saying more action needs to take place. So improving digital and physical infrastructure, investment in financial regulation, institutional support, addressing information gaps, and again, updating tax policies. Which brings us then to what are the strategies for GVC resilience that we think the government or industry can adopt to better integrate India into GVCs. So we want to map supply chains for critical goods and identify the vulnerabilities in our value chains. We want to ensure that there are enough diversified sources or stockpiles for critical goods. It's an either or. We are not saying you should stockpile critical goods. We're saying you should either diversify your sources or create a stockpile. You have to foster a stable regulatory environment, promote best practices in government procurement. What we're implying here is that government procurement rules should have best practices standards, and industry should meet those standards to be able to apply for those government procurement bids. Invest in public-private partnerships, harmonize logistics and transportation rules, ensure policy coherence, and support the workforce and well-being. All of this is a précis of something which is far more complex, which you will find in the report, and our panelists are there to explain to us. So I will stop here. Thank you for your time. Mr. Bhatia, over to you.
Jhanvi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Jhanvi, also for summing up lots of hard work done by you and the team over the last few months to get to these results, many of them very predictable. Welcome, panel. I'm going to jump right into the discussions because I think almost everybody's known. If you want, we can take a moment to introduce everybody and then go into that discussion. So when you make a comment, please, just before that, if you wish to. But otherwise, I think it's all on the agenda, and I think our delegates will do well to get your comments in time. Let me start by asking Mihir, since you write on these issues, which means study a lot and assimilate a lot of these things and then put it across in a simplistic manner. There's a lot of discussion around supply chains shifting because of the geopolitics. There is less discussion about supply chains shifting right now because of labor issues or costs and stuff like that, but really a lot of this survey, of course, shows that there are many other issues, geopolitics being one of them. In reality, other than the lot of hype and talk that is happening at Quad and ITTF, and now as we go to the presidency of G20, what is your assessment in reality of where India stands to benefit, or how is it done over the last 2 or 3 years since this issue has become or come into prominence, perhaps just before COVID, and then in the third year? Thank you.
Thanks, Virat. That's a very good question. I think that, and particularly in the context of this survey, one thing is very clear. The constraint, the push factors pushing investment into GVCs in India are, in many cases, geopolitical, right? And that there is a certain level of base trust in India's orientation, in India's political openness, and in India's transparency as a polity. The constraints are actually not what you and I would necessarily, well, you would have, but maybe I would not necessarily have thought of 3 or 4 years ago, which is that skilling and raw materials, and these feed directly into questions of, are we getting our population in place right? And is the other end of our value chain working properly? So are we getting inputs into the country as effectively as we want to get eventual outputs out of the country? So there is an interesting thing that emerges from this, that there continues to be enthusiasm, driven in many cases by a desire for resilience and for trust and for diversification, all these words that we've heard in the context of value chains for a while. the constraints that we need to overcome are constraints of workforce and constraints of ensuring that people who make the investments get the inputs into their factories that they need.
Thank you. Nitin, if I could come to you on when we were just preparing for the panel, had a very interesting discussion of the whole issue of Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliance that has been our mantra for a very long time, and then huge focus on exports, certainly since 2021, when we were hitting sort of at about 300, 280, 290 billion, now at 419 finally last year. In the context of global supply chains, which is essentially by definition global and must cross over the barrier of import substitution and domestic supplies, but also sort of serve to the world. How do we as a nation, which has been obsessed with self-reliance and a certain definition of Make in India, now look at this whole issue of global supply chains, which basically turns the original theory on its head and say you've got to actually supply to the world to become big, because contrary to the belief that India is a very large market, actually the world is a multiple times larger market. Are we ready for that? How do we get over this ideological mindset, which is also driving policies, industrial policy, trade policy to an extent, and also our discussion around FTAs?
So thanks, Virat. See, I think, first of all, we've got to get over this idea that you can ride a bicycle by pedaling hard on one side or with one leg, which is exports. You do exports and you assume that the thing, you need to pedal on both sides, because are the obverse of exports. And unless you have a free import regime, you won't have a dynamic export regime. So, but let me just take a step back. I think looking at this survey, comes to my mind that we don't have a political economy which promotes greater integration with international markets, save in a few industries. Maybe the software guys and the technology guys probably want greater integration, but other than that, the broader industry doesn't. But people like us, therefore, have a role to promote the greater, India's integration into the global trading system. And let me just explain to you why, right? Generating high growth, I think this came out very well in the mornings. Generating high growth for a long period of time is India's national interest. I cannot think of anything which is more important than that. Now, if you want to do that, there is one thing which is critical to that, is you have to plug into the international trading system. Our prosperity of the last 25 years came because we were exporting to the world. Our export growth was always higher than our GDP growth. We were exporting, we were trading, we were importing, and our own success story tells you that the growth can only be generated through this mechanism. So we can't lose sight of it. And the second, which is a concomitant of that, is that our growth has to be on the back of large-scale manufacturing. Now, for the last 100 years, people have told us, and we've told ourselves, that both these are not possible. We can't plug in because, our industry is weak, and we're this and we're that, we are insecure and all of that. And second, somebody will always tell you that we can't have large-scale manufacturing in India because of A, B, and C, and D reasons, right? This is 100 years. I've actually studied this. This is a 120-year-old excuse ecosystem. We have to break this excuse ecosystem. There is no other way. You're talking about people who need there are 20 million people who need a job every year. That's your asking rate. And the best you're doing is 2 million. There's no other way, right? So I think we've got to make this point to everybody who's willing to hear, and also people who are not willing to hear. So a lot of industry will not want to hear this. A lot of industry still thinks that export is the way to go. You pedal very hard on the right side of the bicycle and you'll get somewhere, right? You'll go around in circles, most likely. So now the question is that how do we get there? And I think we can leverage the Make in India success story, at least as far as the confidence it is given to a lot of people, to say that now let's try and use this confidence to go out and literally conquer the world. I agree that the multinational trading system is not what it was, but it is in our vested interest to push and become the new champion of multilateralism. Everybody will tell you that, oh my God, how can you do that? I don't know, but we have to do that. That's for us a matter of survival. It's existential, right? So if you are looking for a new champion of globalization, it has to be India. And I think in the last 10 years, we've created the conditions in terms of confidence, narrative, etc. for it. And even for that matter, Atmanirbhar might not necessarily be, a contradiction in terms. You can be Atmanirbhar, you can also do global trading, because that's the way we are. We are a country of contradictions. We can always do both. So that's where I want to leave it there. With the simple last point is that the industry will not help us in this. This survey tells us a lot of things, but if you want industry to tell you that, look, we need to globalize, we need to interact, they won't do this. It is a job which we have to do as people in the thinking establishment of the country, because it is counterintuitive. And in the short term, a lot of industry will not grasp the importance of this. Just go back to 1991 and the opposition that you had for reforms from the industry. And yet these industries succeeded for 20 years. So I think we have to do the next version of the same thing.
It's being suggested that the industry needs coaching and hand-holding and practically to be led, because on their own they won't sort of cross this barrier. In part, it might be true. We've seen also varied results here. I mean, pharmaceutical seems to be on fire in terms of the reforms they require. I thought electronics will be higher. I think they have some way to go. So this policy of integrating with the world in global supply chains, do you think a sector-wise approach would be better depending on where the industry is? I'll just give you an example. On the electronic side, there is almost 28 to $30 billion of mobile phone manufacturing that happens in India. 97% of the phones made in India, sold in India are made in India. On the other hand, 90%, 85% of all laptops sold in India are imported. So even twin products, there's a completely different, there's import substitution on one side required, export promotion on the other. So your view on, is this a sector-wise approach that the government requires? How best to kind of get this thing going? Because then it's ministries and stuff like that that comes into play.
Thank you, Virat. See, basically what is happening is, I don't think it is a sector-wise approach. There are some sector-wise approach, but there is a total approach. Now, I'll tell some sector-specific examples to illustrate my case. For example, you may be reading always in your newspapers that, dairy is very sensitive for India. And we have to identify the reasons for the same. The reason for the same is that it is very difficult for any cooperative to establish a technology-based traceability down to 2 to 3 farmers. So there is a cooperative level issue, but that doesn't mean a farm level issue, like, private sector in India can do it. So there are people who have some issues which needs to be resolved. So that's my first point, and help that they need. The second point is that, when you talk about a value chain across sectors, there has to be the user, the company that wants to locate to India need to find a need to locate. In case of laptop, you have the ITA one, they can do a zero duty import, so that electronics can also be a zero duty import. So they are not really that much manufacturing in India. But yes, we hear the Apple story. But the point is that, which my speaker before me met, is that import is not all bad. You have to allow a free flow of raw material and intermediate good. You have to allow the foreign companies to test market. And in food products and other products, for each product it is different. Unless you test your market, you will never be able to understand that whether there is a demand, and you will not invest. Many of the people, if you just ask the same question for when you will invest, they will say, first let me test market. So that is another thing. Third is that, the entire supply chain is something which we don't know. Neither we as researchers know, because you have to go back to the HS code 8-digit level, see the supply chain as, because your tariffs are at 8-digit level. Then you give different tariff line to different trading partners. So you really don't know what is happening. Let me give you the Korea example, because at the time when the Korea negotiations were there, we were very much a part of it. We were told if India is not exporting or importing, or if we are producing something which we are very, very strong about, you give zero. So we gave zero duty in zinc and in steel to Korea. Korea also, and we didn't say, no, you have manufacturing automobile, you will not get it. But Korea never wanted to get a zero in automobile. They just made a fool out of us. They wanted to get zero in steel. And post-Korea, we are so scared, we don't want to give zinc and steel to UK, EU, anybody who doesn't manufacture steel, we are very worried to give a zero duty. See, we are going by our past experience, but we have to go by where our trading partner is more competitive in the value chain. And the Korean zinc example is what something I want you to take and see how Korea, which is not, it doesn't have zinc, has taken over the US, China, Australia, and everybody under the world in zinc by one smelter next to a port. And that's how the supply chains are developed.
Thank you. Mr. Singh, as a functioning policymaker, on the only one on this panel, who's currently active, let me ask you this whole contradiction that is being presented, which is tariffs. You need to have low tariffs, you need to have large-scale imports of raw material if you want to do big exports, because even China, which does about 1.3 trillion of manufacturing in electronics and $900 billion of exports, its largest export, imports nearly $700 billion worth of electronics, primarily from 4 countries, and almost entirely duty-free. So do you think we are ready as policymakers, as the finance ministry and the policymakers, ready to make that distinction? Because as she said, this needs to get into a lot of details of HS codes at 6 level and 8 level and start looking at countries and markets and product lines and which have shifted and which will. Is the mechanism in place to deal with these contradictions? Because this has to be done product by product, almost sector by sector. This is a lot of people required, lot of industry engagement required, almost on a daily basis. Do you think the government is ready for this?
So thanks, Virat, for the very specific question, but you would kindly permit me a little more generic answer before I move into this? Please. So, no, I'll come specifically to what you asked, especially about electronic industries. First and foremost, this entire discussion we are having today on global value chains and how India can integrate with it, we all know it's not a new discussion. It's been happening there. The significance of integrating with the global value chains in different areas has always been on the agenda for India. So it has, of course, taken on a new sense of urgency with the changing global situation today and the different challenges which have come up. Entirely a new paradigm shift has happened in the way we are doing business, in global trade. In fact, another example is that there's been a re-examination of GVCs. So re-examination of GVCs, which India has been a part of or India is proposing to be a part of. And there's also talk of friend shoring on the table. There's a talk of making new alliances among similar-minded countries, as possibly as a defense against those nations which do not think similar to you, to not garner unfair advantages. So these are the new paradigm shifts which are happening, and this is something which India is taking note of. So the point I'm trying to make here is that number one, the global value chain discussion is not new, but it is in a very different context today. India has always been aware of it. India is now very well aware of the challenges which are there at present. So the first point, which was in fact not really a part of the report which was presented today, but was part of the invitation that we got. Yes, global trade is clearly influenced by the geopolitical factors, right? Diversification of concentration risks, of everything being concentrated in one nation, or the diversification happening at the behest or at the directions of that particular manufacturing hub and nobody else really making decisions. All these are areas which most countries, including the specific sector which you mentioned, are being clearly addressed. The second point which I would like to share is what I've just touched upon, that the GVCs in present are under a very different global, new global alliances which have come up. You mentioned the India-Australia ACTA. And you mentioned the trade deal we have had with UAE. These are just two examples. We also have our agreements with Japan, Australia, and India, all aimed at building more resilient supply chains. Now, are they defensive? Are they cooperative? I'll leave it to the jury. So, friendshoring, new alliances, these are all present-day geopolitical realities which India is operating on. Now, having said this, a crucial point which I would like to make is that GVCs for India are not a standalone concept, are not something which can deal with. They are a part of a larger India's development strategy. Now, this India development strategy is not essentially which is built on a certain strategy which was adopted by a certain country in the 80s. It has cost the whole world. It has cost the world in terms of its climate cost. It has in terms of environmental cost, in terms of relationships. Many of the problems we see today are probably arising out of the particular strategy adopted by certain manufacturing hubs which came up. Can we really recreate them? Can India just copy, cut, and follow the same path? No. So the challenge today before the Indian policymakers is, which we are really engaging with, is how we are going to really write down, script an India development strategy of the present, which is uniquely Indian. We are talking about a 5 trillion economy. We're talking about 10 million jobs to be created. And we're also talking about sustainability. We're talking about becoming the global leaders in achieving SDGs. Many a country who have got the resources have quite forgotten about SDGs. India has not. We are already talking about sustainable and inclusive development. A country which has got probably a 1/10 or 1/20th the GDP per capita of many advanced nations is still talking about every Indian to be inclusive, every Indian to participate in the development in the development story. So that is uniquely Indian. We're talking about protecting the climate. The Indian Solar Alliance and many such initiatives are a clear example of how India is so focused that our development story is absolutely uniquely Indian. And I can say with absolute confidence that India's leadership in the G20, which is going to commence in about less than 4 months from now, is going to reflect this. We will all be a part of it. So when we talk about the India's unique model, this is reflecting in the various policy decisions. Now, one example we can take, Make in India. Now, it's Make in India for the world. You can interpret it the way you want. But the fact is, it is a uniquely Indian story. It does not have to be divorced from the global ambitions which India has for the world. When we talk about PLI, the performance-linked incentives, they're not against anybody. Are they supporting GVCs? Yes, they are. Are they talking about creating global champions? Yes, they are. Are they at the cost of somebody else? No, they are not. They're offering the same incentives which we offer to a domestic player as to a global player. We are inviting them to make in India because we know when you make in India, you will become champions of production in India and we'll be able to export. And that's how we will integrate with the GVCs of the world. I believe the next session is on health. So, I will not dwell on that. But vaccines and our research in pharma. And pharma is one of the PLI sector making medical devices. Now, in the process, are we protecting ourselves against massive imports? Yes, we are. So, I would not really go into pick and choose from the Indian, but I would request that, we see the GVCs and every other policy decision in light of the larger India's development story. Specifically, I know I'm exceeding my time, Virat, but so that you to say that I didn't address your question. Similarly, with manufacturing and electronic sector, if it is necessary to strengthen the India's development story by reducing appropriately the input tariffs, yes, we will do it. It will be required. If it is required, and we are facilitating it. Okay, so thank you so much for.
Thank you. We'll leave the last. Best. I'm going to turn to Mr. J.S. Deepak. You've represented us with great distinction at WTO. You understand the whole issue of FTAs really well. You've helped negotiate some of those, been in many of the discussions in many years that you spent, both in electronics and then after that in commerce and then back in electronics. May I ask you two questions, actually? One is the elephant in the room that normally doesn't enter the room, but I think it's worth discussing, which is in the context of GVCs, it's clearly established that China has done an outstanding role over the last 20 years. But as I think Mr. Singh said, that India needs to have a unique model. How do you see that learning and the engagement with China? Do you see there kind of a discussion there? Because that's an important discussion to have. It's not something we can completely ignore. What's your view on that? How do we deal with that model, and how do we deal with that as a, let's say, a competitor? And second, if I could ask you to talk a little bit about the trade agreements which has been discussed and their impact on the growth of GVCs. Of course, all of it linked to India's self-interest and growth of GDP.
Thank you, Virat. Ladies and gentlemen, let me start by congratulating ORF on this survey report. Long time ago, the founder chairman of Infosys, Mr. Narayan Murthy, said that in God we trust, everyone else needs to bring data to the table. And the fact that this report is based on a survey of 200 companies who are wanting to integrate into JVCs makes it extremely valuable. Thank you. Before I go to your questions, Virat, let me just make a few points related to GVCs and trade. You know, trade as an engine of growth is well recognized, but for India, it hasn't been firing for the last decade. The last year has been an exception, but I would say it's perhaps not sustainable, related mostly to pent-up demand and the price effect. If we need the trade engine to fire, India needs to be part of GVCs, and this is the premise I'd like to make. Because, one, some estimates tell us that 70% of global trade is through global value chains. More importantly, the nature of the beast of this GVC is such that it allows developing countries to be part of them. You know, to be part of production, manufacture, exports, even of products, by getting into small areas where they may have a competitive advantage, and thereby share in jobs, growth, and wealth. The GVCs obviously have a high end, which is design, R&D, marketing intensive. They have a lower end, which is assembly, labor intensive. And obviously the value additions are different. The profit margins are different. But for a country like India, which needs jobs, even the lower end of the GVCs, which we aspire to in many areas, is not something to be scoffed or sneered at. So the premise I would like to make is that if India is to become rich before it becomes old, we need to integrate in certain important GVCs in certain sectors. Now, the last 4 years have been one of disruption as far as trade is concerned. There has been the US trade, China trade fiction, the pandemic, the Ukraine war, and there has been this narrative of onshoring, reshoring, diversification in supply of GVCs, resilient value chains, China plus one strategy, and so on and so forth. Obviously, this has an opportunity for India. And certain examples like that of Vietnam show how it can be done. So before I take up Virat's questions, let me just look at, since this is a session on Indian policy choices, look at some trade-related areas which we need to address to make a success of this strategy. First, the need for certainty and predictability in trade policy, which is also coming out from the survey. In the last 3-4 years, we've raised tariffs on 1/3 of all products. Now this, for a country whose exports are import intensive, is a harsh attack on its competitiveness of exports. We have a lot of water between our bound tariffs and applied tariffs, but we don't necessarily need to use it. We need to be, maybe in agriculture and other areas, that makes sense, but we need to ensure that we are competitive, our exports are competitive, and we cannot become a high-cost economy based on high tariffs and subsidies, which we once were. Coming to FTAs, something which Virat alluded to. You know, FTAs, as the Vietnam experience shows, is the best way to integrate into global value chains. Being part of the CPTPP, as well as of RCEP, Vietnam has low tariffs all across the board and very deep and good trade agreements with important economies globally. And they have leveraged it to become part of global value chains. India needs to learn a lesson from this. I mean, deep FTAs with our major trading partners, the EU, the UK, Africa, the CIS. These are our major trading partners which we need to look at. You know, naam ke vaste, kasam khane ke liye FTAs, where you start a negotiation and, you know, as an early harvest, you get a few things, will not help in this integration. Also, the trade agreements need to be comprehensive, including investment, protection, and promotion measures, as our trade agreements of Korea and Japan were, and they have been successful in bringing up the auto industry to what it is. Today, post-BITs, India has investment agreements, maybe 3-4 old BITs, and investment agreements with Brazil, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, Belarus. This is not where our investment is going to come from, and this needs to be looked at. The third point which I would like to leave with you is the need for improving business climate. Infrastructure has been dwelt at. We have a 5% disability. It needs subsidies like PLI to compensate. But what about logistics? The UPS representative who contributed to this survey pointed out that a 4-day delay in logistics is like a 1% increase in tariffs. This is something we need to look at, and the state of our ports is a disgrace. And unless we do that, we are unlikely to be competitive. The fourth point, trade facilitation. I mean, it will take time to get into deep FTAs. In the meantime, we need to be careful that trade facilitation is taken seriously, and it should be not only facilitation for exports, but also facilitation for imports. Imports, you know, both exports and imports create job. Exports create job in manufacturing. Imports create job in services like shipping and logistics and insurance, provide choice to consumers, provide cheap inputs for our exports. So both of them create jobs and wealth and do good for the economy. So we need to be mindful of the fact that perhaps we've not done enough for import facilitation as we have done for exports. Now, quickly coming to the China issue. I've been advocating and writing on this, but it's mostly a lonely voice. You know, geopolitics impacts trade. Everyone knows that. It's easy to understand that if you have good geopolitical relations, you should leverage them for improving trade. But equally, or perhaps more important, is the strategy with those with whom you do not have good geopolitical relations, as in the case of China. Now, being part of major global value chains is not something which can be done at the flick of a switch. Take the example of electronics. China has most of them, and most multinationals which anchor these global value chains are looking for China plus one for resilience and safety and diversifying risk, etc. Apple, for example, and since Virat is here, let me take that as an example, gets mostly Taiwanese EMCs to manufacture its mobile phones. But most of the other equipment, whether it's laptops or tablets or headphones or all the rest of it, is manufactured by Chinese companies in China. Many of them would like to relocate to India as an alternate source of supply in this time and age. But what do we have in the form of a policy? We have Press Note 3 of 2020, which says imports and investment, more importantly, from countries with whom we have borders is banned. Now, investment for setting up new GVCs is not going to come from Mexico or the US or UK or anywhere. It's going to come from China. So we do understand that there is a strategic issue, there is the border issue, but in national interest, we need to be more nuanced. Maybe a case-by-case approach, joint ventures, whatever. Unless we allow for investments from Chinese companies to come in areas which are important but not sensitive, we will not be able to shift GVCs from China and become the China plus one, like Vietnam has become. Again, China has a huge electronics component and subcomponent ecosystem. If we have to add value in our manufacturing and get to the higher end of the GVCs, we need to get a components ecosystem in India. It cannot be created from scratch. It will take time. Speed and scale is possible if you can shift part of it from China by incentivizing those companies and by nudging MNCs to push them here. The ecosystem will also bring skills. I mean, we have an expansive program for skill development. But again, it takes time. Unless you have skills, you cannot be in the value-added part of the GVC. So it's extremely important that we do this. Virat referred to the Chinese model where they export 1.3 trillion worth of electronics. They manufacture 1.3 trillion. They export 900 billion, and they import 700 billion. Where do they import this from? From Taiwan, Korea, South Korea, and Japan, all of them with whom they have bad relations. In the WTO, we have a famous saying, if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. So the ability to get beyond geopolitics, to leverage trade and investment for growth and jobs is something which we need to learn. And the Vietnamese example in one way, the Chinese example in the other way, is something which are good practices which we will like to follow. I think I'll stop here, Virat. Thank you.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left. I see Eli with the delegates. Do you have a comment or a question that you would like to offer? Please.
So I heard two concerns. One was jobs, and the other was exports and growth in the GVCs. And my question is, how do we think about sectors like textiles, which employs I think in manufacturing, it is the biggest employer in manufacturing. And yet when one looks at recent markets, so anecdotes, no data. So in God we trust, and here, yes, I'm not bringing data, but just walk into a mall, and if we look at any of the organized retail in garments, you see made in Bangladesh, made in Vietnam, made in Cambodia, basically the ASEAN countries where garments are being made and jobs are being created. What is the vision for sectors like that, where on the one hand, they were the biggest employers, and yet in the process of zero duties and integrating with the world and opening up to trade, the big ones like textiles are declining. So what is the strategy that the country has?
You for questions, please, if you have a question or a comment to offer. Okay. Do you like to?
Yeah, I have a very quick answer to that. I don't think we should have a sectoral approach at all, because picking sectors is just second to picking winners. You never know, where something is going to be. So I think we need an overall policy framework which encourages large-scale manufacturing and which implies, as somebody said, very low friction imports, very low friction ability to hire and acquire land and so on. And whether it's textiles or whether it's nuclear energy, we don't know anything which works. So I'm just taking that. Although to take a point, Tirupur, which used to make massive amount of textiles, is a wasteland today because most of the industries and the investors have gone to Bangladesh. So there is something there which needs to be fixed, but I don't think the government is so competent that you can fix all little problems in all little sectors.
Just to follow up on that idea, Ila, today we say we'll want to make a textile policy because we are concerned about labor, the labor composition of textiles. It's a labor-intensive industry. Tomorrow, somebody will come and say, no, you have to treat cotton textiles and polyester textiles separately because they have different implications for national growth and for employment, or for then we'll subsplit that and we'll have different sectoral policies. It'll keep on multiplying, all right, because everyone will create lobbies to one way or the other, and it will overwhelm the decision-making capacity within government, which is already overwhelmed, right? So, 2 PLI schemes were enough to overwhelm it. We now have 15. So, yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
So, Ila, let me answer your question directly. Labor-intensive sector is something, which is, we are in a world of 4th IR technology. So now you can automate it to mix colors to, manufacture. So, so one is that their unskilled labor will be going off. Skilled labor will be there, and Indian textile industry and apparel industry is getting there. When they are understanding it can be still a cheap labor in India, but the world is changing. Now the problem that you see is in your export market. So if you see because what you see here is what the Zaras and the H&Ms and others are seeing, right? That's your big retailers, and that's what you see in the shop, is because that our exports are facing a huge lack of competitiveness because of the FTAs. Therefore, the textile and apparel industry will be first to put their hands up and say 0 for 0 in any trade agreement which is with the key markets. So, yes, there is a problem. But within that, they have created their own problem. So, the textile will say keep the import tariff high, which will impact the apparel. So, this is also happening over the last 3-4 years. So, these are the 3 issues. If you think about these 3 issues, that if we have 0 for 0, if we negotiate on 0 for 0, which the industry is talking about, and we negotiate on rules of origin. We today, the domestic industry says, give me 40% rules of origin. Export industry says, give me 30% rules of origin. It's because you're not value adding that much in the country. And with the UAE, you have 40% rules of origin. So we have to work together within the country as an industry, and definitely textile. If we just do what Vietnam and Cambodia is doing, I think we can get there. We have niche products like cotton, linen. We have organic cotton is something which is coming up, but we have to go there.
Mr. Deepak.
You raise a very valid point. See, in textiles and garments and clothing, our competitors are Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia. And they are part of CPTPP and RCEP, which I mentioned. They have 0 duty for exports to both the US and Europe, which are the bigger markets. And we need to match them if our textile industry has to have an export-led growth. Now, the problem of negotiators is, companies trade, not countries. So, you can protect the king, the queen, the bishop, but you have to give away the pawns. And in India, the problem is that you want to protect all industry. Textiles, because of its size, because of the jobs it creates, and its importance to the Indian economy, obviously needs 0 access in EU, which is being negotiated, which will be in bigger markets. But then you have to prioritize that you have to give somewhere, otherwise that's not a negotiation. So unless we get this concession through a deep FTA with a large economy, which is, that includes Africa, the CFTA, as well as the CIS, our exports as a source of promoting textile industry would remain.
We've exhausted the time. The timer is off, but we are in the extra time space now. So in hockey term, it's sudden death. Go ahead, Shashank.
Hi, I'm Shashank Matu. I'm a junior fellow with the Observer Research Foundation. My question is to Ambassador Deepak and also to Professor Mukherjee. So you just mentioned about the value of having a Vietnam-style free trade agreement situation. And earlier this morning, we had Mr. Ashok Malik come out and say that India was looking for more feasible trade agreements. I may be reading between the lines, but perhaps that meant that CPTPP and RCEP is not what we're looking at. We're not looking for deep FTAs. So I wanted to get your sense on whether you think the feasible trade route that we're looking for countries that we trade with, UAE, Australia, we can buy and sell. Do you think that's the appropriate export model that India should be looking at? Or is perhaps the more wider-ranging, deeper free trade agreements, as you seem to be advocating, which is the right path, in your opinion?
I believe that FTAs have a role, and we need to get into new FTAs. The point that I try to make is we should not have FTAs with economies with whom we don't trade. So Australia, UAE, maybe a good start. It's like a warm-up, but it should move from there. And what we need is these 4 big blocks, which are major trading partners, the EU, UK, the CIS, and Africa. I also would like to draw a red line as far as RCEP, basically China is concerned. In RCEP, we have an FTA with almost everyone except China, and the US. I don't think we can fight in the same weight class or box in the same weight class as these. Having an FTA with China, as was the problem with RCEP, would wipe out our manufacturing in 60% of the sectors. If you're willing to sacrifice this, the other 40% would benefit. So that's okay. US, we are not ready for them because they have, I'm 6 feet tall, we have Virat is 6.5. The US has an asking list in agriculture, which is about 7 pages, 7 feet. So, I mean, if you're willing to sacrifice your agriculture, your dairy, your poultry, the future of your farmers, you can do an FTA. So FTAs are important, but they have to be targeted, they have to be strategic, and you have to choose the partners very carefully, or else there is a negative side to it.
Thank you. Riveting discussion. In addition to that, the moderator gets 2 inches added to his height before he leaves the session. There can't be a better outcome. Thank you so much. A round of applause for the panelist here.